For over 2 decades, conservatives have been among the least likely Americans to embrace fears of catastrophic man made climate change. The same is true of evangelicals. Is there a change underway? Should there be? What could be leading some in that direction? Well, tonight on From the Stacks, we'll discuss that and more with Bill Peacock, former director of policy at the Energy Alliance. Currently director of policy at the Energy Alliance, formerly vice president and director for economic freedom at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, also formerly deputy commissioner for coastal resources at the Texas General Land Office, and deputy assistant commissioner for intergovernmental affairs at the Texas Department of Agriculture. Bill is a very sharp guy. He's contributed a chapter to a book that I'm editing. We'll talk a little bit about that later in the program. And it's a real pleasure to have him on the show tonight. Before we get to that, let me just mention that the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, which sponsors From the Stacks, every month seeks to give away educational resources. And our giveaway this month is the booklet Social Justice versus Biblical Justice: How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel. We have given this away in the past, but this time around we want to give 2 copies away as our way of saying thank you when you make a donation of literally any size and request it. Why are we offering this again? Well, for one thing, it's been one of our most popular. It's something that people have come back to again and again, and many people have ordered repeatedly from our website. And they seem to be finding it very, very helpful in talking with lots of folks about social justice, about critical race theory, about the woke movement, and so on, progressive ideas, because this booklet carefully defines justice biblically and then carefully contrasts that biblical understanding of justice with the understandings that are common in the woke progressive movement, and also fleshes out the implications of all that for our understanding of what are rights and what are duties and so on. So we would like to give away 2 copies, one for you and one for a friend, or if you've already read it yourself, already have it, well, two for friends. All you need to do to request yours is to go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just simply write in promo code 22-03 or the simple title, Social Justice. Whichever one you do, we'll know what you're looking for, and we'll be glad to send you 2 copies absolutely free, and 100% of your donation, no matter what the size, will be tax deductible. So we hope that you'll take advantage of that offer, and welcome to From the Stacks for tonight. Now I'm glad to bring on our guest, Bill Peacock. And Bill comes to us from Texas, and where he is the policy director for the Energy Alliance. Bill, tell us about a bit about yourself, your background, about the Energy Alliance. What drives you in all of this to have so much interest in these issues?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Cal. I really appreciate it. When you're going over some of my bio, it sounded like I'd worked for the government my entire life, but I haven't. I spent about 10 years working in the Texas legislature, the Texas House, Texas Senate. Then, as you mentioned, worked in a couple of environmental agencies, the Agriculture Department and the Land Office. Dealt with coastal issues at the Land Office, and then moved on into the Texas Public Policy Foundation, where I started focusing a lot on energy issues. And you can't get into energy issues without getting into the whole debate about, it used to be a debate about pollution, if you will, but now it's become about CO2 and global warming and those kinds of things. And then I left TPPF 2 years ago or so, and have gone out on my own with the Energy Alliance. That's a group that focuses on bringing issues about energy to the public. and letting them have an alternate view, if you would, of what they often hear about through mainline media, and then also do some teaching. I teach government and economics. So,
Yeah. You mentioned in the midst of that that you used to focus a lot in the legislature and so on pollution related to energy, and then you said nowadays the focus tends to be on carbon dioxide, CO2. Well, a whole
right.
lot of folks really think of CO2 as pollution. You seem to distinguish the two. How come?
Well, I mean, you know, when Adam and Eve were first created, they started breathing in CO2. Right? It's in the air. God put it there, and so I have a hard time thinking of, you know, one of the primary ingredients in the air that we breathe as being pollution, right? You know, pollution would be things that we put in there that don't well, haven't been there in the past, and so, you know, like particulate matter, things that, you know, can cause asthma, or things that cause ozone, those kinds of things. That used to be the debate, but now they've moved on to something else, and you have to start wondering
Mhm.
at some point in time. At first, we were running out of oil and gas, and now then we weren't. Then there was global cooling, then there was pollution, and now it's climate change, global warming. You know, if there's
Mhm.
something more going on behind it than the science, maybe.
Yeah, it does seem like it, doesn't it? And of course, when Adam and Eve first came on the scene, they were not only breathing in CO2 at probably somewhere around maybe 1,000 parts per million, maybe a whole lot less than
Right,
that. Who knows how much vegetation there was around the world when they came in? God created the
right,
plants, and so and they make CO2. But they were breathing it in, but they were breathing it out a whole lot higher concentration than they were breathing it in. Today, we
exactly.
breathe it in at about 400 parts per million, and we breathe it out at about 40,000 parts per million. So, about 100
Right,
times the concentration. And it is difficult to think of CO2 as pollution when, after all, it's absolutely essential to all plant growth, and it's essential to all animal growth. And it's just basically essential to life. One of my old friends, an Australian scientist, uh, whose name slips my mind at the moment, used to call CO2 the elixir of life. And I think that's a good reason not to think of it as pollution. And of course, all sorts of things can become pollution in high enough concentration that are not pollution in low concentration. But we're nowhere near that for CO2. I mean, in order to become at all toxic toward human beings, you have to get CO2 to well over 10,000 parts per million. And even then, it takes many, many hours of exposure. And as soon as you get out of it, you're fine again. So,
right.
and we're nowhere near with CO2. Bill, as particularly as a Christian, how do you approach these things? Your Christian faith has clearly, uh, influenced your thinking about these things, and yet you approach them also scientifically and economically. So, how do you integrate those things together?
Well, it's been fascinating for me. When I first got into the field of public policy, I was not a very informed Christian, and it was about 10 years in where I began to develop a more direct Christian worldview. And but I brought in conservatism with me. And I grew up in the age of, or came of age in the age of, like, Ronald Reagan and William F. Buckley Jr. And so I brought that core with me, and then I put them together, and that really forces me to go back to the beginnings, if you would, about, you know, why God created this world, and what He had in store for us and it in it, and he clearly wanted us to use it, right? You know, be fruitful and multiply and have dominion and fill the earth, and we're supposed to use this earth, not abuse it or use it up, but use it in order to accomplish God's goals for us. And so if we come in with that mindset, I think it gives us a little bit different view of the process of going, looking at, whatever the product of our use of it is. And it also kind of
Mhm.
alleviates the fear that a lot of people have, is that we're going to use everything up and we're going to run out of things, because which is kind of silly on the surface if you look at the size of the earth and our impact on it so far. But
Yes.
even more so, just from a Christian perspective, we would have to think that God isn't going to give us a task to fulfill and then not give us the resources to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Clear back in the 1960s, people were saying that we were going to run out of all sorts of different minerals. Paul Ehrlich, in his book, The Population Bomb, that was published in
Right.
1968, said, hey, the battle to feed humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will die of starvation, and there is absolutely nothing that we can do about it. Famine is going to force this. He predicted that we would run out of a variety of the most important minerals to our economies. And uh, Julian Simon, whose work
Right.
I'm sure you're familiar with, Julian Simon challenged him to a bet. He said, uh, Ehrlich, you pick any 10 minerals you want to pick, and we'll make a bet that you will say that if those minerals are cheaper, adjusted for inflation, by the end of 10 years, you'll pay me $1,000 per mineral. And if they are more expensive, adjusted for inflation at the end of 10 years, I'll pay you $1,000 per mineral. Come the end of the decade, Ehrlich wrote Simon a big fat check. And then Simon offered to do the bet again for the coming decade, and Ehrlich wouldn't do it. and
Decline.
he's
Right.
never been willing to do that since with anybody else, though other people have repeated the challenge. And the fact is that over time, every single mineral that we extract from the earth, every single resource, mineral, plant, or animal that we extract from the earth has become uh, less scarce, not more, over time. And that really puzzles a lot of people because, of course, we're using things. Well, if we're using them, must we not be using them up? Well, people can imagine, okay, for plants and animals, they renew, right? Plants grow back, animals can be conceived and raised and so on. But minerals? What about minerals? They, after all, don't grow back, at least so we think, although we do keep getting things extruding out of the mantle of the earth. And yet the explanation seems to be that because human beings are so creative with our minds, we're able to figure out new ways to use things, new ways to find things, new ways to mine things, new ways to refine things, and all of that. Uh, every time we turn around, we're finding ways to use minerals at lower and lower concentrations in the Earth's crust and still be able to do it more cheaply than at the much higher concentrations necessary in the past. So the reality is that all of these different things are declining in inflation adjusted price rather than getting more expensive. And Simon, of course, talked about that in his big edited volume, The Resourceful Earth, back in 1984. And then his book, The Ultimate Resource, and revision of that called The Ultimate Resource 2. And then in a big fat book, another big book that he was the general editor of, and I was the managing editor, called The State of Humanity, that came out in
Right.
1995. And the sad thing is that it seems like so many people in the green movement just aren't learning. There are exceptions, like the Danish economist and environmental scientist Bjorn Lomborg, who, when he first encountered Simon's work in the late 1990s, was really pretty well outraged, and he said, "This is atrocious. I'm going to refute this. I know how to use statistics, and Simon has obviously misused them terribly." So he went about doing all the research to refute Simon, wound up being persuaded the opposite direction, and wrote his
Right.
fabulous book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, for which, of course, he then was absolutely demonized by the Green movement. But unfortunately, very few people seem to grasp this. But you have grasped it. The folks at Texas Public Policy Foundation, the folks at the Energy Alliance have grasped it. But it seems like fairly recently, I think the fears about climate change have replaced these fears about running out of resources, and they're the new sort of pathway, the entry ramp to going green. Um, and you recently ran across an article in World Magazine, or did I bring it to your attention? I think I brought it to your attention, didn't I?
Yeah.
Called
Well, no,
"Young
we
Republicans."
subscribe to it here, and so I ran
Oh,
across
okay,
it, and then we talked
okay,
about it. Yeah.
all right. Yeah, and it's called "Young Republicans Embrace Climate Care," and when we talked about it, I asked if you would write an article for the Cornwall Alliance about that, and you did that. It appeared as I think it was the banner article in Human Events uh,
Right.
a couple of weeks ago, and or a week and a half ago, and it's a really excellent piece. And so I'd like to just talk a little bit about what's in that now.
Sure.
You start out by saying that you came of age politically in the age of William Buckley and Ronald Reagan. So you escaped being indoctrinated into the progressivist ideology behind John Maynard Keynes's economics and Rachel Carson's environmentalism. So, uh, first off, uh, just sort of define those two terms for us. Uh, Keynes's economics and Carson's environmentalism. What is it that you find troubling about each of those, and how was it that you managed not to be sucked in by them?
Well, by the grace of God, really is how I managed, I guess, not to get sucked in by them. Um, yeah. So John Maynard Keynes, everybody or a lot of people are familiar with Keynesian economics. Keynes writing in the 20s and 30s, and he's famous for his ideas of how to stimulate economic growth, particularly in the face of depression and those types of things. How do you get us out of that and back into a robust growing economy? And his answer is stimulate aggregate demand. Right. The idea is that people aren't spending enough money, and therefore we need to do something to get them to spend that money. And so who do we have step up to do that? Well, it's the government, because the government spends money, and then people get money from that, and then they turn around and spend it. And but the problem with that, of course, is that if you and I just we start spending money and we keep spending money and we're trying to stimulate something, eventually we run out of the money. And
Mhm.
so the idea that you can just stimulate economic growth by spending money kind of flies in the face of common sense. Unfortunately, that's the mainstream economic thinking today. You run across in almost any major university, just about anywhere today. It's kind of
Yeah,
sad.
but while if we just keep spending, we run out of money, government doesn't have to do that, right? It can just make some more.
Well, that's the problem. They're really they are running out of money. They just pretend like they're not, because all money, dollar bills, we've gone from gold to silver to paper, and but still it's the same truth behind it. Is a dollar bill just represents the wealth behind it. And so if you print another dollar, we don't have any more wealth. We just have another piece of paper. And
Mhm.
so we may not be running out of money, but we're running out of wealth. Right. And the
Yeah.
people who get the paper are in good shape, but those people who don't get the paper, at least early on, get beat up by the whole thing because what they do have is worth a lot less.
Yeah, if I go to an auction and there's a beautiful painting on the block to be auctioned, and I have $50,000 in my pocket, well, $50,000 is the most I can bid. But if suddenly somebody throws another $50,000 in my pocket, now all of a sudden I can bid $100,000. Well, what that means is that each of the original $50,000 in my pocket is now worth half as much as it used to be toward that painting. So what happens is that as we expand the money supply, we reduce the value of money. And most people think of rising prices as inflation, but classical economists defined inflation not as rising prices, but as an increase in the money supply. And rising prices were the consequence of that. And unfortunately,
Right.
Keynesian economics crowded out classical economics. And now most people think of inflation as the rising prices, and they have no idea what causes those rising prices. But of course, the quantitative
Yeah.
easing that we've been going through for the last decade now has has vastly multiplied the number of so-called dollars out there, and thus now we're starting to pay the piper with uh, with price inflation, unlike anything that we've had since the 1970s.
Yeah, it's kind of sad. Of course, that's very convenient for those folks who are printing all the money in the government, because if inflation, nobody likes inflation. So if inflation was printing more money, then we could all be mad at the government. But if inflation is in rising prices, then the folks in the government can say, "Oh, look, it's this oil price shock over here, or it's they're not growing enough wheat over here, or some big business is charging too much money." They can
Yeah,
blame everybody else but themselves.
yeah, we've certainly watched President Biden blaming the big oil companies for jacking up oil prices. Has nothing to do, of course, with the fact that we have expanded money supply so fast without expanding the supply of goods and services in the marketplace. In fact, we shrank that supply through 2020 and 2021 with all the nonsense lockdowns on our economy over COVID. And
Yeah.
then he actually shrank our production of oil and as well as natural gas by stopping permits, stopping pipeline constructions, all sorts of different actions that he took actually on his very first day in office. So that was Keynes and Keynesianism. How about Rachel Carson and her environmentalism?
Yeah. So, Rachel Carson wrote her famous book, Silent Spring, in the I think it was early 1960s, and
Hmm.
talking about a lot of the problems with a lot of things that were going on environmentally in the days, and some of the issues she was dealing with were, real problems out there, and she liked to talk about pesticides in particular, and other things, and uh, it, and a lot of her problems were, like I said, real, but they were being caused often, and people don't realize this because most people don't know the book anymore. A lot of the
Yeah.
problems that were being caused environmentally were being caused by the government, right, rather than business. Right, people think of business is the problem today, people are the problem today, but really a lot of times it's the government, people through the government. For instance, so I think one of the things she talked about was a lot of these mosquito spraying programs that were government
Hmm.
does, right, or used to do.
Yeah.
They don't care about mosquitoes anymore, but and it's not necessarily that the government shouldn't do that. It's how it's done, and what they use. And so most of her, even though a lot of the things she was talking about identified as problems were caused by the government, uh, she, to some extent, but even more so, the people who followed onto her, decided that we needed government to fix the problems that government had been causing. And so we came up with the radical environmental movement in the
Hmm.
1960s, which is really kept on. It has different targets today, perhaps, but it's going on. Like getting rid of DDT, right, over in Africa,
Yeah.
because of the impact on certain animals. Who cares the fact that if you get rid of DTD, then you have malaria, which actually kills people, right? And,
Yeah.
and so
Right.
that was kind of what came out of the 1960s on her side.
Yeah. Right. And by the way, there's a really outstanding book called Silent Spring at 50. It's by a group of authors. At the moment, I can't remember any of their names, but I read the book about, 5, 6 years ago. Um, and it just goes through Carson's claims one by one. And as you said, some of them are legitimate, some of them are really well founded, but many of them, the majority of them even, were based on very, very poor science, badly manipulated statistics, and so on. And particularly her case against DDT, which supposedly was going to lead to the extinction of many bird species in North America, especially songbirds. And when they went extinct, we wouldn't have birds singing in the spring, and hence we would have silent spring.
Right.
Well, it turned out that actually DDT had next to no impact on bird populations. And she also had claimed that it was toxic to human beings, and it turns out that it's completely inert in human tissue. One person who was arguing against her back in the 1970s and 80s would walk on stage and he would eat DDT by the teaspoonful and say, "Look, this is just simply completely inert in human beings," and it certainly didn't kill him. So that's Keynes and Carson. Um, what do you think we're seeing among many young conservatives and young evangelicals that's leading them to sort of get into the environmental movement, to embrace that bandwagon?
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that struck me about the World Magazine article was its depiction of all these young conservatives is the way the magazine labeled them. Uh, They were they're about the same age today that I was when Reagan had become president, and and I was going, well, this isn't. How did I escape that? But they haven't. And I think there's a few things that we might be able to look at on that. One would be just the constant bombardment from mainstream media. I mean, we had that back in the 1980s. This whole battle between left and right is nothing new, and the bias of mainstream media is clearly nothing new. But it seems to have taken on a maybe a higher level, if you will. So that's part of it. I think another part of it is the church isn't fighting back. Like it or not, we had and there were a lot of good things about some of these folks, but we had the moral majority, springing up at one point in time, and other movements in the church that were trying
Hmm.
to bring about a Christian perspective on these issues. Just like all things, they weren't perfect, neither or anything we're doing today as well. But nonetheless, there was some pushback to all that back in the day, and not that that's not going on today. Cornwall Alliance and a lot of others, but the many in the church itself seem to have succumbed to a lot of the uh, worldliness that we get through the mainstream media
Hmm.
every day, and so they're not pushing back as well. And then the final thing is, I think there's just a lack of understanding today of what God's perspective on government is, and
Hmm.
how He created the world to function, the types of governments He created, how they're supposed to interact with each other. And we just don't see a lot of that anywhere in the world. And
Yeah.
certainly, even if you're just coming at it from a more secular perspective, we seem to have lost the sense of limited government, free market conservatism. that used to be
Hmm.
embraced by the Republican Party and others like that. So,
Yeah, a perspective that I think is not just a matter of political preference. I wrote a book called Prosperity and Poverty: The Compassionate Use of Resources in a World of Scarcity as sort of a general introduction to economics from a biblical worldview and ethics perspective. And in that, I argued that private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, the rule of law, all of these things are really essential, not just to a productive economy, but to a moral economy. Uh, some other people have made the point a little bit different way. Walter Williams, one of my favorite economists, died about a year ago. Said, "Look, there are two methods of exchange. There's the peaceful method of exchange, and in that, if I want something that you have, I have to offer to give you something that you want more than you want what you have.
right,
And if I can't do that, then I don't get what you have." And then there's the violent means of exchange, and that's if I want what you have, then I use force to take it. And a lot of people will say, "Oh, but I'm not using force to take anything from anybody." Well, you may not be, but the people you and your neighbors have elected to Congress, to state legislatures, and the people they've placed in various agency offices, they are using force. Force? Really? Well, try not paying your tax bill and then refusing to go to jail when when the IRS comes after you. Force will be used as necessary. And so
right,
I think really that this is a very definitely ethical, moral issue, and that unfortunately we've lost sight of that. My book, Prosperity and Poverty, by the way, is available through the Cornwall Alliance's website, cornwallalliance.org/shop, and people can find that there. Um, we're about halfway through the time now, and I want to remind our viewers of Cornwall Alliance's offer for the month of March through the end of this month as our way of saying thank you when you make a 100% tax deductible gift of literally any size. We would like to send you two copies of this booklet, Social Justice versus Biblical Justice: How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel. This would be one for you, one for a friend. If you already have one, two for friends. This is something that can really help people see through the anti-biblical understanding of justice that dominates the social justice, woke, progressive, critical race theory movement. So to request your copy, all you need to do is to go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, just go to the comments field and write in promo code 22-03 or the title Social Justice, and we'll be glad to send you two copies. Also, if you're watching us right now live, if you type in comments to the comments field on either Facebook or YouTube, we should be able to see those, and we'll try to respond to any questions that you might have during the remainder of the show. All right, so now back to Bill Peacock, and you wrote an article in response to the one that we saw in World Magazine. You wrote, "Will Young Conservatives Embrace the Ideology of Climate Change?" Came out in Human Events. And there you say that article in World Magazine began with a profile of a 24-year-old Andrew Eisenman, a recent graduate of Liberty University, who's begun to vote Democrat because of the Republican Party's position on climate change. And according to Eisenman, uh, climate change is, quote, "an urgent threat that will increasingly disrupt weather patterns, causing severe storms, crop destruction, and other deadly disasters." Uh, just interact with that brief quote from Eisenman, Bill. How What does that reveal about his own awareness of the scientific uh, basis for fears about man-made climate change?
Listeners know, Cal, we live in a fallen world, and we have a hard time maintaining a proper perspective on things. And humans are very, myopic when it comes to things. We tend not to look in the broad world around us, and we tend to look in the present rather than the past or the future for that matter. And so,
Mhm.
when somebody says we're having an urgent threat by all these, and then they point to all these things that are going on in the world, hurricanes and tornadoes and those kinds of things, you have to start thinking, well, didn't we have hurricanes and tornadoes and all that sort of stuff 50 years ago and 100 years ago? I mean, it's sort of a myopic vision. He's not the only one guilty of it, but I think
No, no.
that's one of the problems, in they're leading with that story.
Yeah, and young as he is, he has a pretty decent excuse for
Right,
that. Whereas people who've been around for 50 years or more, maybe they should have a little bit better memories, or maybe at least they should have had some time to look up some trends. And if they had, for instance, they'd have found that actually, there were more frequent and more powerful hurricanes in the 1950s and 60s than since the 1970s. That there has been no increase in either the frequency or the intensity of hurricanes over the period of supposedly human induced global warming. And I'm not questioning at the moment, by the way, whether any of global warming is human induced. I think probably some of it is. Uh, but there's been no increase in the frequency or intensity of them. In fact, there's been some decrease over the last decade and a half. Um, Likewise, with tornadoes, the most active tornado period for the United States, which is far and away the most active tornado place in the world for particular geologic and geographic reasons, the most active period for tornadoes in the US on record was the 1950s. And we've had a significant decrease in both the number and the strength of what we call very intense tornadoes, F3, F4, and F5. Now, we've had a great increase in the number of detected tornadoes, F1 and F2, but that's not because there are more of them, but because we've got Doppler radar now that finds them very quickly, even where no people are around to see them. So if
right.
we compare apples and apples, there's no increase in the frequency of those either. Similar things about floods and droughts and all sorts of things. We just don't have this terrible uptick in any of these things. Um, but you write that there is a remarkable lack of curiosity in World's article, as well as among the young activists, regarding the validity of these claims of urgent threat associated with climate change. Um, World Magazine is a specifically Christian magazine. By the way, it's among my very favorites. I have been a friend of its founder, Joel Bells, for goodness, 40 years now. A friend of its former editor in chief, Marvin Alasky, for about 35 years now. And well, more than that, also about 40 years. And so I admire World Magazine. And yet, when I read this article, I thought to myself, gee whiz, this could have run in New York Times or Washington Post. There doesn't appear really to be uh, any any attempt to get beyond the MSM sort of treatment of climate change issues. Does that concern you? And I know that you're a longtime fan of World Magazine as well. Does that concern
Oh
you?
yeah. Yeah, as like you, I've known Marvin Olasky since not quite as long, since the late '90s. Matter of fact, he
Hmm.
helped counsel me through my marriage counseling before
Huh.
we got married with my wife, and so
Huh.
we went to church together, and so we've
Oh,
known
that's
him
great.
and valued World, yeah, valued World Magazine for a long time, and still do. But I think it's not just World Magazine. I think it's a general trend in the church today.
Hmm.
We see in a lot of churches, not everywhere, but in a lot of churches that are just failing to look closely at what the world is telling us, right?
Hmm.
And you know, and I think it's not just about climate change. You could go off into issues of race or science about how old the Earth is, or all different kinds of things. And so I don't
Hmm.
really know uh, exactly what the problem is or how it's come to be that way, other than the fact that I think we really need to double down looking at scripture to help us
Hmm.
work through these issues, because too often in the church today we tend to treat scripture pietistically, that it's just about our personal growth and salvation and those kind of things, and we've kind of lost this dominion look at the world, like
Hmm.
your longtime friend Gary North would often talk
Yeah.
about the
Who
Dominion
just died a
Covenant,
couple of
and
weeks ago.
exactly. And I love the
Yeah.
fact that he and Gary DeMar ambushed you when you went down to revisit him, and you're expecting to go see a man who was didn't have long to live, which in fact was the case. But there he was, sitting up and ready to interview you for a podcast. I thought that was great.
That was an
Um,
amazing experience.
Yeah. So anyway, so Gary and you and many others, take more of this dominion approach, and so we need to peruse the scriptures to tell us, well, what can we learn about science? I mean, it's not going to tell us everything, but it gives us a
Hmm.
framework for that. What can we learn about government?
Hmm.
What can we learn about economics? Uh, those types of things.
Yeah. Yeah. And just since you brought it up, I do want to address the term dominion, which I think is an absolutely wonderful term. It's a biblical term. Genesis 1:28 says that when God had created Adam and Eve after his own image, male and female, he blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and everything that moves on the face of the earth." And so we should never ever back off from that term because it gets criticized, but we should be prepared to define it carefully because our
Sure.
critics are defining it in a very different way from how the Bible does. Back in 1967, Lynn White Jr., who was not, by the way, an environmental scientist or anything like that. He was not a scientist at all. He was a medieval historian, but he wrote an article that was published in Science magazine and later reprinted in many, many different anthologies used in environmental science courses in colleges all over the world. His article was called The Religious Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And in that, he argued that Christianity was to blame for all of the abuse of the environment because it used Genesis 1:28, where God tells us to take dominion, to exercise dominion, as a as an excuse, a green light to abuse, to waste, to harm the earth in any way we might wish. Now, of course, White could not provide any documentation of any serious rabbi or Christian theologian or pastor who had ever used the verse that way. This was a complete caricature, but that notion became very widespread. And so
Yeah.
when people hear Christians talk about dominion over the earth for human beings, many of them right away think of abuse, despoliation. Well, that's not the point at all. In Genesis 1 1, in Genesis 1, rather, when we come to that verse, we should be informed by the previous 27 verses. Our opinion, our dominion, since we're made in God's image to be his representatives on earth, should reflect his dominion. Well, what do we learn about his dominion in the first 27 verses? Well, he starts with nothing and gets everything. So he's really, really productive. He he brings light out of darkness, which, as we follow that metaphor of light through Scripture, that's intelligence, it's truth, it's information. He brings order out of chaos and greater order out of lesser order. He brings life out of non life and great variety of life. And he tells every variety of life to be fruitful and multiply and fill its niche in the earth. And then finally, he brings human beings into the world and he makes them in his image and he tells them to have dominion. Well, our dominion should be like his. We should make more and more out of less and less. So we should improve in efficiency. We should bring greater and greater knowledge, understanding, truth about how we use the world. We should bring greater order out of lesser order, more life out of less life. We should do all we can to preserve and increase the abundance and the variety of life on earth. All of these things are what is involved in dominion. I often put it, look, godly dominion is men and women working lovingly together to enhance the fruitfulness and the safety and the beauty of the earth to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors, so that we're addressing really the two great commandments, to love God and to love neighbor. When I
Yeah.
define it that way, I so far I haven't found anybody who said, "Oh, well, I don't like that idea." People think that's a great
Right.
idea, and I think that's exactly what the Bible means by dominion. Um, okay, another interesting point about Mr. Eisenman, Andrew Eisenman, the Liberty University graduate. World Magazine says that he considers climate change to be a pro-life issue. You and I have both discussed that some. What's wrong with depicting climate that way, or climate change that way?
Well, you know, the, that tends to be a movement today among some people in the church that, well, if we're really pro-life, we're not just about protecting babies in the womb, but we're about welfare from the government to help the poor so they have a good life, and then we're about environmental issues to save people's lives through that way, that kind of thing. And
Hmm.
that really, and you've pointed this out in one of your books, Cal, that really confuses the issue, right? So when we're talking
Yeah.
about abortion, we're talking about people intentionally killing a human life, right? And
Yeah.
that's a moral and ethical problem. It's called murder or manslaughter, at least, in the Bible. But when we're talking about climate change and some of these other issues, there's a couple of things going on. First of all, is welfare or reducing CO2 emissions actually going to help anybody? Government welfare, or are there better ways to do that? But leaving aside that
Hmm.
argument, um,
Hmm.
the reason we have CO2 emissions, for instance, is because people are using energy, and the use of energy has brought great abundance to human lives, great
Hmm.
length to human lives. We live, more healthy, more richly today than we ever have in human history. There's more
Hmm.
people living on the earth today because we use energy in certain ways, and we emit CO2. So
Right.
if there are negative effects from CO2 emission, and that's worthy of debate. But
Big if.
if there are, yeah, there, that is not the same thing as intentionally taking a human life.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at all the benefits that we get from using coal and oil and natural gas, whether to generate electricity or to move our vehicles or our planes or our ships and trains and so on, Look at all the benefits that we get from that. Those benefits enormously outweigh any risks that might come from a a, a tiny change in global average temperature. We're talking on a Kelvin scale about a change that is a tiny fraction of 1%. And that is just simply not something from which you ought to expect any huge catastrophic result. I think that's one of the things that I wish people would learn to think a little more critically about. We're told, well, we have increased carbon dioxide from about 280 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution to about 100 almost 120 parts per million now. That's roughly a 50% increase. That's a huge increase. Well, but wait a minute, it's a huge increase percentage wise in what was already a tiny, tiny fraction. 280 parts per million is 28 thousandths of 1%. 40 parts per million, 400 parts per million is 40 thousandths of 1%. And the notion that that change from 28 to 40 thousandths of 1% is going to cause catastrophe, I think runs up against the biblical understanding of God as the infinitely wise creator and the infinitely powerful sustainer and the infinitely faithful uh, governor over his creation. I mean, who in his right mind thinks that a wise architect designs a building so that if you lean on a wall, all of the different feedbacks in the building's structure multiply the stress of your weight over and over and over again until the building collapses? Well,
Right.
no, that would be a very foolish architect. Well, similarly, if God designed the climate system so that all of the feedbacks to a minute change in atmospheric chemistry caused catastrophic results, we'd have to say, hmm, a little questionable about that, the wisdom of that God there. Maybe he was wrong when, after he had created everything, he looked at it and behold, it was very good as he judged it. No, I think uh, we were talking earlier about why it is that so many people seem to be falling for these things, and uh, one of the things that we brought up was the lack of critical thinking. If I have one Bible verse that is my life verse, it is First Thessalonians 5:21. Test all things, hold fast what is good. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of testing going on. That's one of the things that I've appreciated about you all along is that you are always testing things, and you've done that with this recent article in Human Events. Um, to get to another part of that, you say regarding how we're going to solve this current crisis, the World magazine article sets the right tone when it suggests there are common sense, market based, and limited government policies to combat climate change. Yet, you go on, the policies outlined in the article fail to live up to these standards. They include government investment in development of new energy technologies, ensuring that natural gas produced by fracking is eventually phased out in favor of cleaner energy sources, and the carbon tax, which avoids regulation and incentivizes free market solutions to climate change, allegedly, but which in fact is also a government intervention in the energy marketplace. How about building on those for us a little bit here?
Yeah, well, this is one of the things that really got me is that, you know, there the 1980s brought up a new generation, I think, of conservatives who embraced free market uh, uh, policies to address human issues, and that seems to be lacking in the world today. But that really fits in well with the biblical perspectives. As I mentioned earlier, I know you know Gary DeMar, and he's not the only one who's done this, but he's done a really good job of explaining that God created three forms of government. You know, there's
Hmm.
self-governance, we all start with, but then he talks about there's family government, and there's church government, and then there's civil government. And each one is
Hmm.
supposed to operate in different spheres, right? And the family is sort of the institution of health, education, and welfare for people.
Right.
The church, takes care of the poor to some extent. So do individuals and families. They also minister to the people in need and help keep the people in the church doctrinally sound. And then the government is basically the protector of the people who are doing good and bringing the wrath of God on those who do bad. So basically protecting us from violence. And it's a lot more complex
Yeah.
than that. But those are the big things. And so when you have one of the government's operating outside of its sphere, a lot of bad things can happen. And so I think that's what we see here with a lot of these solutions is that maybe the government is stepping outside of where it's supposed to actually be operating, and people should be doing through other institutions, maybe should be addressing the issues. For instance, a perfect example of this is the United States of America and its way it has responded until recently to climate change. So again, we can
Hmm.
debate about the role of of the impact of humans on the climate change, but which country in the world had the greatest success in reducing CO2 emissions since you go back to 1990s or so moving forward was the United States of America. Yet we were the only country that didn't have any government regulations on that. Why was that the case? Well, because people were making voluntary decisions through the free market. And in particular, some businesses got the idea that their customers were concerned about this. And so they started making changes. We had fracking, come along, which moved us from oil into, and other things like that into natural gas a
Especially
lot more.
coal.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sorry, from coal into natural gas. And so all these things in the free market were fixing things, whereas over in Europe we had this just morass of crony corporatism and which didn't do anything to reduce CO2 emissions.
Hmm. Yeah. Right. So you conclude your article by writing this. You said, "What concerns me most about World's article is the portrayal of a growing Christian movement that appears to see economic and environmental issues more through the lens of Keynes and Carson than one consistent with God's word." Um, so we talked a bit about Keynes and Carson at the very start. What do you think? Um, what do you think will be the practical effect, the impact on our lives, on the lives of ordinary people in America or around the world, of the greater use of a Keynesian approach to economics and the Carsonian, if I call it that, approach to environment? What's going to be the fallout of that?
Well, higher energy prices we've already seen. You can take out the recent increase in gasoline prices, for instance, from dealing with Russia and the Ukraine war and those types of things. I think gas prices are down a little bit now, but when the war first got started, gas prices shot up 80 cents over a very short period of time.
Hmm.
But gas prices were up already over a dollar, like a dollar 10 prior to that in the first year of the Biden
Yeah.
administration. And so we see this there's this problem with that people don't see, and it's not just energy. Energy is important, but it's really the capital that goes into building that up and determining where we need to be spending our money, whether it's on energy use or anything else. But energy is so important, and the more we use of it, the richer we get. And yet we have all these energy efficiency ideas today that we need to use less of everything, less water and less energy. And but we have a God of abundance who has blessed us with abundance, and He wants us to use these things responsibly, as you talked about. And so, if we turn away from that, we're going to be turning ourselves into, European style energy poverty, where people live in tiny little apartments and they drive little cars with stick shifts instead of automatic transmissions, and you could just continue on. Uh, that's kind of where we're heading unless we
Yeah.
go back to this biblical free market approach to energy use and basically the economy generally.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so that was, I think, a really excellent article that you wrote that was published first in Human Events. It's also on the Cornwall Alliance's blog. Folks can come to that at the Cornwall Alliance. Just go to cornwallalliance.org and then click on blog, and you can go down and see lots and lots of articles. We tend to post 4, 5, 6 articles a week at least. Now, Bill, I want to turn to a different writing project of yours. It's part of a large editing project that's being taken care of by uh, Dr. David Legates, who is Cornwall Alliance's Director of Research and Education, retired climatologist at the University of Delaware, and me. I did a proposal a little over a year ago, actually encouraged to do this by my friend Wayne Grudem, who's been on Cornwall Alliance's advisory board for, well, ever since we began. Um, I proposed a book with the working title Climate and Energy Policy: The Case for Realism. That may or may not be the title under which it comes out, planned for late this summer. But we've got a number of different chapters in there. I believe it's 17 chapters by about 19 different authors, and you're one of them. You are doing a book that will be titled, and just a moment here, I got away from that. You're doing a chapter titled "The Energy Climate Connection." Tell us a little bit about that, and how you got into the background for that. That was the reason why I asked you to do it.
Right. Well, the what you asked me to do really is bring up the moral and ethical issues that come on this issue of climate
Right.
change and energy use and those types of things. And I, you knew a lot of the folks down at the Texas Public Policy Foundation where I
Hmm.
used to work, including Kathleen Harnett White,
Hmm.
and she wrote a paper for us quite a few years back on
About a
the
decade.
moral, yeah, the moral problems with environmental regulation, particularly when it comes to climate change and CO2 emissions. And she also wrote a book called Fueling Freedom that was published
Hmm.
a little more recently than that. And so that, that really kind of built my background is because I was an editor for all the publications there. And
Uh-huh.
so as I was building on my work in energy and taking in what she'd written, it really just drove home to me the moral problems that come with restricting energy use and just restricting markets generally and people voluntarily making decisions about what the best
Hmm.
use of their resources is, whether it's what energy they purchase or where the energy comes from and those kinds of things. And so that's how I got into this field in particular when it comes to climate change and that sort of thing. And so, you reached out
Yeah.
and worked with me to get me to work on this book.
Yeah. It took a little arm twisting to get you to agree to do it. You're a busy man, and you're a humble man too. You first indicated that you weren't sure that you would be the best person for it, but I think you're exactly the right person for it because you don't just bring the scientific and the economic, the technical approach, but you bring that biblically ethical approach. That is what I was really looking for, and you've done a great
Yeah.
job on the chapter. Bit by bit, we're editing that and all the various other chapters, and I think we'll be back to you with yours fairly soon, the Lord
Okay.
willing. It's a huge job, uh, and an exciting
Well, if I
job.
could, there's one little. I start off the chapter talking about regulation of sea coal. Right, sea
Yeah.
coal. This is England back in the 1200s, 1300s. They call it sea coal because it came over the sea, but it's what we call coal today. And
Hmm.
King Edward and others around in that time, so we're looking at the early 1300s, um,
Hmm.
started regulating the use of sea coal. Well, why were they trying to do that? Well, because the rich and the prosperous in London were tired of all the smog that was coming because the commoners started using sea coal to heat up their homes. Well, as you know, coal is a very rich fuel, but it has to be burned properly to get the most out of it. And if it's not burned properly, you get a lot of waste product, soot, and those types of things. And that's what they were experiencing in London. Well, but the question then is, well, why were the commoners using sea coal? Well, that was because they couldn't get wood anymore because of the commons that people had used to get wood from were more and more being used by the rich and being closed off to the poor to get
Hmm.
wood. And so the poor were being left out in the cold and they had to do something. And now the rich come along again, they're using coal and they want to take away their warmth, and also they use to make pitch, which also make their homes waterproof. And so all that's going on, and I
Hmm.
think we see the same kind of thing today, where elites or the government or however you want to put it are regulating not to benefit the general population, but to benefit some ideal which may or may not
Yeah.
actually be benefiting anybody.
Yeah. If you're a multi-millionaire, let alone a billionaire, uh, the cost of energy from wind or from solar, which when you really get all of the details figured out, is considerably higher than the cost of energy from coal or natural gas for electricity or from petroleum for transport fuel. If you're multimillionaire or a billionaire, those costs really don't matter to you. But if you're middle class, if you're like the vast majority of us, a dollar per gallon increase in gasoline, 50% hike in the cost of home heating oil or of natural gas or of electricity. Those can make the difference between being able to keep your home and falling short on your mortgage payments and having it sold out from under you. They can make the difference between having enough food and enough heat to keep you alive in the winter and not having the combination of those two things. We saw in England uh, in the from the period of 2008 to I believe it was 2012. Um, not quite sure of the years now. That sounds like too short a period. But over about a 6 or 7 year period, when England first adopted major restrictions on the use of coal to generate electricity there and turned more and more to wind, we saw electricity prices go up so rapidly that thousands and thousands of people were driven into what the British came to call energy poverty or fuel poverty, which basically they defined as spending over 10% of your monthly income just simply on home heating in the winter. Um, a result of that was that uh, excess premature winter deaths. That's a sort of a statistician's term. You expect more people to die in the winter because it's cold and elderly people have a tough time with cold. But some of those are premature because they're not well explained by other reasons. Well, there are premature deaths everywhere for various different reasons, no matter where you live. But there are excess ones when various things force them upward. And from about 2008 to about 2012, the number of premature winter deaths, excess premature winter deaths, more than doubled in England, Wales, and Scotland, almost entirely because of the increase in electricity prices that made it so many people could no longer afford to heat their homes adequately and still have adequate calories to keep their body temperatures up. So
Yeah.
literally, people were freezing to death in their homes. This is something that has also hit on the continent in Europe, and America is likely to experience the same kind of thing if we continue to follow the kinds of policies that those who are alarmed about climate change and want to reduce it by getting us off of fossil fuels, which now provide about 83% of all the energy we consume in America, about 85% in the world, and on to wind and solar. So that's something that you've been
Well,
watching for a long time.
yeah, it's everything you said is right, but we don't have to look to Europe for this problem. You're talking to
True
a
enough.
man who lives in a state that had 4 days of blackouts because of our
Hmm.
increased reliance on wind and solar here. When our big blackouts hit, um, you know, it, they hit as a Monday morning. I can't remember February. About 1 o'clock is when the lights started going off here in Texas, and because I mean, first of all, it was just a winter storm that we had never experienced anything like it. It's a 150, 100, 200 year storm. But so
Hmm.
that's the background for it. If we hadn't had that, we wouldn't have had the problems we did. But we did have that, and the reason we things went so bad was because at 1 o'clock in the morning, when ERCOT had to start shutting off power, shutting off power into the system, wind was operating at about 5% of its capacity, and solar, not surprisingly, was providing 0% of its capacity because it was the
Hmm.
middle of the night. And people go,
Yeah.
well, you can't bring that up. It's not supposed to operate. Well, that's the defect in it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we needed it. It wasn't there. And, natural gas had its problems as well. Coal had some problems. Nuclear even had some problems. But just think, we've had, my friend Robert Bryce calculated that
Yes.
from about 2000 until recent, we've had about $66 billion invested in Texas in wind and solar generation. Why did that happen? Well, because they're chasing about $22 billion worth of subsidies, federal, state, and local, which is
Hmm.
on our website, the Energy Alliance website. I've talked about those numbers. They've been chasing that money. And so, they're getting the 1/3 of their money back without even selling a
Yeah.
product, right? So, but just imagine if that $66 billion had gone into natural gas, for instance, then
Yeah.
even with the problems natural gas had, the worst we would have seen that night would have been rolling blackouts that lasted about 30 minutes and they were back on the grid. Maybe we wouldn't have seen any
Hmm.
blackouts at all. So the
Wow.
problems with wind and solar, it's not just for Europe or even New York or California. It's hitting places like Texas.
Yeah. Let's see. What was the name of the Texas billionaire who said the only reason to build wind turbines is to capture the subsidies? Um, who was that?
Yeah, that's the guy out of the Panhandle whose name will come to me in just
Yeah.
a minute.
Yeah. Um, yeah. He owns hundreds, thousands of wind turbines, but he put it clearly that there would be no reason whatsoever to do wind turbines if it weren't for the subsidies because they cannot pay for themselves. The love of money is the root of all evil, and there's really nothing new under the sun. Well, Bill, thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining us tonight. Any closing comments for us?
No, I appreciate the time we've had together to talk about these things. And well, I guess the last thing I'd say is that, I worked for a public policy institute for 15 years of my career. I've worked in government for 15 years before that. And, looking at these things from a policy standpoint, educating people about the policy things, which is part of what you do at the Cornwall Alliance, all that is really important to do. But we're not going to change the system. We're not going to change who we are. We're not going to change how we approach these things unless we're also talking about the whole counsel of God. We start with the gospel, but then we can't stop there. We have to go and talk from Genesis to Revelation and look and see how that tells us how we need to operate, take care of this world, and live in this world that God has given us. And so that's why I'm so blessed to be working with you and the Cornwall Alliance, because that's what y'all are doing, and we just need more people doing that to get us where we need to go.
Well, thank you very much. And we have a comment by a Stephen Leonard saying, thank you for persevering for truth in the face of fierce propaganda. Well, I can certainly say thank you to you, Bill, for that very thing. You have been fighting this battle for probably just as long as I have. I know that for me, it goes back to the early 1990s. I believe it does for you as well. So thank you again for
Yeah.
joining us tonight. And now,
Thank you,
folks,
Cal.
just thanks. A bit about next week's program. Dr. David Legates and I will be discussing our forthcoming book. Uh, Working title is Climate and Energy Policy, The Case for Realism. It's a collection of essays by a variety of different scholars. David has done an essay on the history and politics of climate change that will be the first major chapter. I'll be writing an introduction to the book. We have Dr. Roy Spencer, a climatologist, on the science of climate, as well as another chapter that he's doing on the role of evaporation, precipitation, and clouds. We have Dr. Pat Michaels on a chapter on climate models and scientific method. If you ever wanted to understand why climate models go so wrong, why they are not trusted or shouldn't be trusted to guide our thinking about climate policy, you'll love this chapter. We have Dr. Willie Soon and Michael Connolly and I've forgotten the other Connolly's first name, but they are father and son physicist team out of Ireland on the role of the sun in climate and climate change. We have Dr. Anthony Lupo on the role of the ocean. And then we have Dr. Will Happer and Dr. William Weingarten on the role of greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are for real, and they do indeed make the earth warmer than it would be without them. But the issue is far more complex than that, and you'll see a tremendous explanation of this by them. We have Dr. Nicola Scaffetta on a chapter called The Holy Grail of Climate Change, Quantifying Climate Sensitivity. That is, how much warming can we expect from added CO2 in the atmosphere? Dr. Timothy Terrell, an environmental regulatory economist, on the role of energy in human thriving. And we have Robert Hefner of Hefner Energy on sources of primary energy. Bill Peacock, we just heard from. His chapter is on the energy climate connection. Dr. G. Cornelis Van Kooten on costs and benefits of energy options as one of his chapters. And then another chapter on how economic thinking can help tackle climate change. And then finally, we have a chapter by Mr. Vijay Jayaraj, an environmental scientist and climate scientist in India, called Climate and Energy Policy in the Developing World. So this is a book that we've contracted with Regnery Publishing to bring out, to have this out by late summer of this year. And David and I, editing it together, we will be discussing some of this book next week on From the Stacks. So we hope that you'll join us then, get a sneak peek preview at this. And meanwhile, thanks again for joining us tonight. Remember, as our way of saying thank you, when you make a 100% tax deductible donation to the Cornwall Alliance of literally any size, doesn't matter how big or how small, and request it, we'll be glad to send you 2 copies of Social Justice versus Biblical Justice: How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel. To request your copy, go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, just write in promo code 22 03 or the title Social Justice, and we'll send you 2 copies. Thank you again so much for joining us tonight. Look forward to seeing you next week.